Let's review over how conflict is crafted within a story and the important role it plays. In narrative writing, whether it's fiction or nonfiction, there are typically at least one of the following conflicts, and you may be familiar with these already. The first one is person versus self. This is where your character struggles to overcome doubts, personal struggles, or character flaws. We also refer to this as an internal conflict, and we'll talk about that a little bit more in depth in just a minute. The next one is person versus person. This is one of the most popular ones. This is where characters are pitted against each other. Often there is a hero, which we call the protagonist, and a villain, which is called the antagonist. You'll also see person versus nature. This is when a character is pitted against nature. So what that means is they might be caught in a storm, lost in a forest, or fighting against the elements to survive. Another conflict is person versus society. So this is when people are pitted against the norms of their society. And what this means is they're going against, or maybe they don't fit in what their society considers as normal behavior, or maybe the rules of how you should act and what's expected of you. Also, there is person versus supernatural. This is when a character goes up against a supernatural force. Maybe it's a spirit haunting a location, or it's a force that we're not quite sure what it is. It's unknown. There's usually more than one conflict in a story. Often the writer will include an external conflict and an internal one. So let's talk about external conflicts and internal. With external conflicts, this is a character or characters are struggling with an outside force. So most of the conflicts we just talked about are external, with the exception of person versus self. That is an internal conflict. That's where your character is going up against themselves and having to make some sort of decision or answer some sort of dilemma. A lot of these internal conflicts are a result of something that happened in the external conflict, which is why you'll often see a writer have at least two conflicts, external and internal, in their story. There may be multiple conflicts layered into the story, but the protagonist usually has one main conflict or obstacle to overcome. Writers can use conflicts not only to create an interesting story, but also to develop character and theme. So let's look at how that all goes together. Among other things, conflict drives the plot. The ways the events play out are very much influenced by conflict, and we can see this in an example on our plot diagram. So if we start out with the exposition, which as a review is the introduction to a story, and we have a group of people leave on a hike. And then in our rising action, we will have a couple different conflicts. You'll see here that we have tension between two of the characters. We also have another character doubting herself, and then they all get lost and a storm comes up suddenly. And these are all examples of our conflicts that we talked about earlier. So the first one, the tension between two of the characters, is person versus person. The character doubting herself is person versus self. And then them all getting lost and a storm coming up suddenly is person versus nature. The climax of the story, where the conflicts kind of reach the highest point, is when a fight leads to one character almost falling off a cliff. The doubting character saves him, and that leads us to our falling action, where they put their differences aside to find their way back home. The resolution, which ends at a higher point on our plot diagram, is they arrive safely, tension is resolved, and the person who doubted herself now believes in herself. You'll notice that all of our conflicts have resolved, and our characters are not in the same place that they were when the story started, so that is why our resolution ends up higher than where we started. So the way conflicts are resolved or not, they're not always resolved, will be an important element of the plot and the message of the story. So in the example I just shared, the characters were able to rise above the tension and self-doubt they were feeling to defeat the obstacles that nature threw in their way. Because of this, they arrived home safely and they grew to be better people, and this gave us a resolution to our conflict. However, imagine that the conflicts weren't resolved in some way. What if one character couldn't get over the issue that caused the tension and let the character who was clinging to the cliff die? Or maybe the self-doubting character doesn't step up to help. The writer might choose to not resolve these conflicts to show that it's important to defeat your inner demons. You're not always going to have a happy ending or you're not always going to have every conflict resolved, and that's okay. How a character deals with the conflicts, though, will shed some light on who they are, and that's another important thing to get out of conflicts. So, for example, if he deals with a conflict with a friend by taking responsibility and making some changes rather than blaming everyone but himself, your character might show strength of character. Or if they deal with conflicts against the norms of society by trying to make positive change, then that would show that they have determination. Writers can also create a message by illustrating how two contrasting characters deal with the same conflict. Maybe one's positive and one's negative, and that will also help reinforce a message. Here's where I want you to consider the text you're currently reading and think about these questions. First, what are the conflicts in the text? And secondly, how do these conflicts illustrate some aspect of a character's identity within the story?